everybody, and welcome back once again to my channel. Today is an exciting video. It is not an unsolved true crime case, but today I am bringing you a video all about lie detectors and why they are not reliable. Before I begin today's video, please excuse my coffee teeth. I totally got all ready to film. I did my makeup and everything, and then I realized I didn't brush my teeth after my coffee this morning, so kind of looking weird, just letting you know. So tests to detect lies go back quite some time. I'm not going to delve too deep into the very far back history about trying to detect lies, trying to obtain confessions from would-be criminals. Also, please excuse any noise you may be able to hear in the background there. My daughter is awake right now. I was unable to wait until she naps to film this video because I think it's going to be kind of long. So jumping right back in, it was in 1895 that Cesar Lombroso created a test for detecting lies that measured the blood pressure while being questioned. After that, in 1904, Vittorio Benussi, he created a test that measured a person's breathing while being questioned. And then in the early 1900s, William Marston created a test where he measured the blood pressure of German prisoners of war. And what he found was that he believed there was a correlation between systolic blood pressure and lying. It was in 1921 that John Larson created the first kind of polygraph test as we kind of come to know of it today. He created a test that measured both blood pressure and breathing, and he first used this to try to solve a theft case at the U of C Berkeley campus in the women's dormitories. There were thefts that were going on, and essentially the police couldn't really get a straight answer from people, so they had really no solid direction to go in as to stopping these thefts from taking place. So they ended up bringing in John Larson, and he used his machine, and he actually kind of made a big display of it, demonstrating how he was able to tell who was telling the truth and who was lying or who wasn't being truthful about everything. And in this, he supposedly found out who had been stealing things. However, it's still kind of unclear today as to whether or not that person really truly did steal those things. She said over and over again that she didn't do it. She said this even kind of after having committed it. She said, or confessed it. I mean, she did eventually still say that she didn't do it, but then way later on, years later, she sent John Larson a letter saying, you know, that she thanked him for helping her to come to realize that the thing she was doing was wrong and to change her life. And it's all kind of really interesting, and if you guys want to read more about that, you should definitely check out the book, The Lie Detectors, A History of an American Obsession by John Larson, or not by John Larson, I'm sorry, by Ken Alder. And I did just review that book on Monday, so I will leave a little card up in the top corner for you guys in case you are interested in checking out that book to read for yourself, because it goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to be providing for you today, because there's so much information to give you guys. So definitely read that book if you're interested. But anyways, it's still kind of a little unknown whether or not he really did get the true person. He was not able to recover the items that were stolen even after supposedly finding out who took them. That person was so frustrated, she just wanted the test to stop taking place, that she ended up just replacing one of the rings that she had supposedly stolen, like this really expensive gold or diamond or something ring. She ended up buying a new one to replace herself because she didn't have the one that supposedly she had stolen, but she didn't have a story for where that ring would have ended up either. So yes, she was so frustrated with being put under these lie detector tests and told over and over again that she was lying that she just confessed. And so that kind of is the direction that the lie detector would end up taking. But before we jump too far into that, let me tell you a little bit more about the history of the lie detector. So in 1939, Leonard Keeler kind of added to this test. He included measurements of the sweat that is produced on a person's skin while they're being questioned during a lie detector test, and this is known as the galvanic skin response. Now, he actually worked under John Larson. They worked together. He was like, you know, John Larson's protege, and they worked a lot on the polygraph test, and it was actually after Leonard Keeler kind of came on board that polygraph became essentially the official name for this machine. And so they worked a lot together. They worked for many, many years, and eventually they ended up parting ways because they had very different ideas for what to do with their machine. They also had very different levels of confidence on the ability of this machine to adequately predict, or maybe not predict, but indicate, that's a better word, indicate that a person was telling the truth or telling a lie. So part of the reason that Larson and Keeler fell apart was that Keeler kind of started telling people that the polygraph machine was infallible, that it couldn't be wrong, that it always could predict for you or indicate for you whether or not a person was lying. And he was trying to pass off this machine as something that was always 100% true. And anybody in the scientific field will obviously understand that if you're trying to tell somebody that your machine can literally never fail, that it never gets anything wrong, that's really hard to believe because mistakes happen, and especially if you are talking about a machine that gives you results that then have to be read by humans. So there is a lot of reason to believe in the scientific realm that the machine is not 100% infallible, as Keeler was trying to say. And Larson very strongly felt that it was wrong for him to be going around and saying these things, that it was clearly an over-exaggeration of the machine's abilities, and that it was going to give false hope to people that this test could solve so many cases just by, subjecting witnesses, subjecting suspects to the lie detector. There were just so many things that were still questionable about this. Another thing that Larson didn't like was the idea of selling the polygraph machine to places that were not police stations. He really did not think that this was a good idea, but eventually, after the patent on the machine had kind of run its course, Keeler was able to start selling these basically without Larson's agreement on the topic to stores like Walgreens and other places, and they were using these tests to try to find employees that were stealing from them. It was around this time that people had gone through the Great Depression. People were dealing with a lot of financial issues still. The industry was changing from, a basic economy into a wartime industrial complex, essentially, because, of the approaching World War II. There were so many different economic factors that kind of contributed to this, but employers were finding that a lot of their losses were coming from employee theft. And so they wanted to use lie detectors on employees to kind of weed out candidates for jobs who would be more likely to steal from them because they weren't able to be truthful during a lie detector test. And they were also using it to find employees who had already previously stolen from them so that they could fire them. And that's kind of what Keeler was selling these machines to companies for. That's what these companies were wanting them to do with. Eventually, Keeler just continued to kind of progress with sensationalizing the polygraph machine. He tried to get in on celebrity cases, tried to use the machine for a lot of different reasons. He claimed that he could tell you if there had been marital infidelities in your relationships by using the lie detector test on just regular couples, people who hadn't even committed crimes, essentially. And he was also publishing articles trying to kind of build up the sensationalism of the polygraph machine in places like the Reader's Digest, for example. He was trying to work really, really hard to give the machine more validity than it had in essentially the scientific realm, the scientific field. He was trying to kind of just push it out there on people and get them to believe in it. And we're going to kind of talk about why it's important that people have confidence in the machine itself for it to be able to work. So Ken Alder also wrote an article for the Representations Journal in 2002. He, again, is the one that wrote The Lie Detectors, which I reviewed back on Monday. Really good book. Check it out, guys. And he wrote a journal essentially talking about lie detectors yet again for the Representations Journal. In this article, he stated that the machine would not work unless the people believed that it worked, essentially saying that if you don't believe that the machine can catch you in a lie, you're not going to have the same responses when you're being asked questions while strapped to this machine that are going to basically trigger results that show that you are possibly lying. So if you don't believe, if you don't have confidence in the machine itself to predict that you're lying, it's very easy for you to be able to not have those responses, and then the test is not going to be able to reveal whether you're lying. So a lot of the polygraph working is in people believing it. If you think that this machine can catch you in a lie, you're going to have physiological responses that you can't control because you're worried that it's going to say that you're lying about something if you're lying. So a lot of this test really does have to do with whether or not a person believes that it can catch them in a lie to begin with. Alder also goes on in this article to explain how the polygraph machine hasn't changed very much throughout the decades. And this is definitely of great importance because in these past few decades, we have learned so much about human psychology and the human body in general, how we respond to different things and how that relates to, our brain processes and whatnot. And we've learned so much about that area of science that it's really strange that we haven't been able to make any improvements to the polygraph machine. Essentially, there just hasn't been a whole lot of change to it. There hasn't been a lot of effort to improve it because people already have confidence in it, and that's kind of what makes the test work in the first place. So you would think that we would have made improvements at this point, but we haven't because we haven't needed to, because people already feel confident enough in the test's abilities. So one of the things that Keeler really wanted this test to be used for is for interrogations. The idea is that you use the test to intimidate a suspect and essentially kind of lead them into making a confession. It doesn't necessarily have to tell you if that suspect is telling the truth or telling a lie, and a lot of the times, even if you pass the test, well, maybe not a lot of the times, but there are many cases where even if somebody has passed a polygraph test, an officer will tell them, well, you failed this test, we know you're lying, trying to get them to confess. And of course, that is still 100% legal for officers to do, so we're not going to discuss that part of the test, but that is a tactic that officers use. They use the test as an intimidation tool during interrogation to try to get a person to confess to a crime, whether they may have committed that crime or not, and we do know that false confessions do happen. This was something that Larson very strongly disagreed with. He thought that the test was not reliable enough to be used in criminal cases. He felt that the test was more suited for the psychological realm, for research in that area, dealing with patients who have mental illnesses and trying to study that kind of stuff. And we're not going to dive too far into that because obviously that's not really what the polygraph is used for today. But that's kind of the direction he wanted to take it in, and Keeler did not want to do that at all. He decided to take this to police stations. He wanted to use it in interrogations as an intimidation tool, and Larson was so very strongly against this. So let's move on real quick to the reason that the lie detector test is not admissible in court, because this is very important. This is something that we definitely have to talk about in relation to lie detectors. So the reason that the lie detector is not admissible in court is due to the Fry case. I will have the case code down below in my sources. As always, I leave all of my sources pinned as the top comment in the comment section down below. So if you guys want to check out where I got all this information, feel free to go and do that in the comments down below. They will all be right there as always. But yes, so there was the Fry case, and essentially it was a man who killed a physician. He later went on, not in the same day, but later on, essentially, he went on to commit an armed robbery. He was picked up for this armed robbery, he was arrested, and during interrogation for that, he confessed to the murder of the physician. And I think I said that weird. The physician. And anyway, so he confessed to this, and then later on, he recanted his confession, and he said that he only confessed because a friend told him that if he confessed to the crime, he'd get part of the money that they were offering as a reward for helping to close the case, essentially, which is obviously terrible advice. Don't take that advice if anyone gives it to you. But that's what he claims. He claims that he did not actually commit the murder. He only confessed to get the reward money, and I don't know why he thought that would work, but he did. not the point. So after recanting, he went to trial essentially, and what they did is before the trial they had him take Marston's version of the polygraph, because this was kind of a little before Keeler got involved and whatnot. This was before all that, but this was shortly after Larson had kind of come out with his machine, but they contacted Marston. And as you remember, he measured systolic blood pressure while questioning people about crimes, and that was the test that he had developed. And so it was a little dated at that point because we did now have Larson's machine, which tested both blood pressure and breathing. It was definitely a little bit more reliable, a little bit more believable at this point. But they still contacted Marston, and they had him come in and do his lie detection test on Fry. And according to the test, he was innocent. He was telling the truth that he falsely confessed to the murder in order to get the reward money. So Marston completely believed in this man's innocence because he believed that his test was so reliable that it could not fail. So Marston tried to get his test into the courts so that he could prove Fry's innocence. That's what he was hoping to do. Well, the judge did not let him do this. They did allow the defense to briefly talk about the test and the findings just a little bit as they were trying to introduce it as evidence for the case. So the jury did hear that, and eventually Fry was convicted. He was found guilty, but because of the polygraph results, they didn't feel comfortable giving him a first-degree conviction, so he was convicted of second-degree murder, which gave him a life sentence in prison rather than the death penalty. So essentially it did help save his life, but the judge did not let the test into the courtroom, and essentially this set the precedent for, up through modern time here, that you can't really admit a lie detector test as evidence in a trial, or at least in a criminal trial. And so we need to talk about that a little bit, because they did appeal this case on the basis that the judge did not allow them to submit the polygraph, or Marston's systolic blood pressure test, as evidence for lie detection in this case. And so during the appeal, the appellate judge, they ruled against Fry. They said that basically there wasn't a good enough reason to admit this as evidence, and I'm just going to read for you real quick what that appellate judge had to say on the matter. Just when a scientific principle or discovery crosses the line between the experimental and demonstrative stages is difficult to define. Somewhere in this twilight zone, the evidential force of the principle must be reorganized, and while courts will go a long way in admitting expert testimony deduced from a well-recognized scientific principle or discovery, the thing from which the deduction is made must be sufficiently established to have general acceptance in the particular field in which it belongs. So overall, the judge decided not to allow the admission of Marston's lie detection test, not because it was a failure according to him, but more because of its power. Allowing for people to introduce a lie detection test when it isn't formally recognized as a super reliable form of detecting lies within the scientific community, it gives it so much power in a trial that it could completely sway a jury one way or the other. And something that Keeler really wanted to do was eventually to rid the criminal justice system of juries altogether. He wanted to be able to use the polygraph to essentially replace juries, and you would just polygraph test different people involved in the case, and then eventually you would have your one person who you knew was lying, who you knew committed the crime, and then that would be proof that they had done it, and then you could convict them, and then the judge would just have to sentence them to whatever the punishment is according to law. But of course that is not what happened. Marston introduced his systolic blood pressure test very early on. It was already becoming a primitive form of lie detection in the scientific community, and because of this, he essentially created a standard for the courts in what kind of expert testimony and what kind of scientific evidence they would allow into trials. And this has actually been used and cited by judges over and over again throughout the decades as reasons for allowing or disallowing certain types of evidence into cases. So essentially, Marston he jumped the gun and he tried too soon. It wasn't ready, it wasn't reliable enough, it wasn't an accepted form of lie detection within the scientific community, and that essentially kept lie detection tests from being admissible in court up until now. So let's talk real quick about a couple of studies that were done about lie detection tests. There was one study done where they took 50 cases of innocent people and 50 cases of guilty people. All of these cases involved some sort of theft-related crime. Now, all of the people who were considered guilty in this study, they had confessed to the full amount that they were being charged with as what they had stolen. And then all of the people who were considered innocent in this case, there were other people who ended up confessing to that theft, which then proved that person completely innocent. So they took these 100 cases and they had 6 polygraph examiners who had just recently finished all of their training, and they had them go through and determine which people were innocent and which people were guilty. Of course, they didn't have that information beforehand. The only information they had is that there were essentially guilty people and innocent people, and they had to determine, according to the polygraph results, which people were telling the truth and which people were lying. What ended up happening at the end of this test is that an average of 37% of the people who were innocent were considered to be guilty by the polygraph examiners. They were considered to have been lying on their polygraph. And that is a huge, huge deal. Essentially, what this study shows is that polygraph examination is faulty. It is absolutely not infallible, and it's kind of a little ridiculous for anybody to think that it is. That's my personal opinion, that last part. But back to the study. So essentially it shows that examination of polygraph results is faulty, and essentially this disadvantages the innocent because people who were innocent were considered by these polygraph examiners to be guilty because they read the test results differently. And these people, I remind you, were proven to be innocent when other people confessed to the crimes and were charged and convicted with those theft-related crimes. However, if we had relied on these polygraph results, those people could have been found guilty even though they hadn't committed the crimes. There was another study of this done in the field as well, and it did show similar results to this. It did show that those who were innocent were likely to be seen as guilty according to polygraph examiners. There's another study done in the Statistical Science Journal, and essentially this study looked at the polygraph examinations of a lot of government employees following when Wen-Ho Lee was basically charged with espionage because he was working for the Los Alamos laboratory. He was working on essentially nuclear science for the nuclear arsenal here in the United States, and it was believed that he was selling nuclear secrets to China. Eventually, from what I was able to find, I didn't have time to look too deeply into this because it's not exactly the point. He was not actually doing these things that they were trying to charge him with. It looked at these tests, and what they were able to determine is that the polygraph tests and the examination of those results by polygraph examiners was not reliable. They said that according to the statistics of the study that they did, that they would highly suggest that polygraph examinations not be used in court at all. They agreed that it was a good idea that they had been essentially banned from the courtroom for so long. These people are saying that the tests were not reliable enough to give you an adequate determination as to whether or not somebody was lying or telling the truth, and this could result in a lot of basically wrongful convictions, and that's a really huge thing to consider when you talk about whether or not polygraph tests are reliable enough to use in court. And I personally do not feel that they are. I completely understand people who refuse to take polygraph tests because they're not reliable. And if you take a test and you're telling the truth, but the examiner says that the test shows you're lying, then a lot of people are going to look at you like you've done something very wrong. So to close out this video here, I wanted to talk about a few cases. The first two I'm going to talk about are people who passed polygraph tests but were later proven guilty. Aldrich Ames was a Russian spy. He was working in the CIA, but he was actually a secret KGB agent for Russia, and he was providing them with CIA information. And he had taken multiple polygraphs, many of which he passed, and he was later actually found to be a spy, and that was why they had been giving polygraph tests in the first place, and they weren't really able to detect during these polygraphs that he was lying and that he was in fact a spy, but they only found that out later on. He was able to pass multiple tests, and there actually is in the sources down below a link to a letter that he had written to another person, essentially talking about polygraphs and why they're basically faulty. There's also Gary Ridgway, who is also known as the Green River Killer. He killed 48 women that he at least confessed to. It's believed that he may have killed up to 70, if I remember correctly. Anyways, he did pass a polygraph test early on in the investigation of these murders, and he was able to pass that, but he would later confess to having actually committed all of these crimes, like much later on in the investigation, by the way. So I mean, that is just remarkable. You have two people who committed pretty ridiculous offenses, murder and espionage, and they were able to pass lie detector tests, and, you know, people kind of stopped looking at them a lot of the time because they passed these tests. And if you just think about the fact that maybe the Green River Killer could have been caught sooner if people hadn't been relying on just a simple polygraph test. And it's amazing to think about it like that, because, you know, people died, and investigators weren't looking at him as much as they should have been because he passed a test that isn't completely reliable. There's also the case of Bill Weggerl, and the difference here is that Bill actually failed a polygraph test, but in the end, he was proven innocent by DNA evidence. It was back in 1986, I believe, that his wife had been killed, and he was given a polygraph test and he failed, and for 20 years of his life he was seen as a terrible person. People believed that he had killed his wife, that he had committed that crime, but there wasn't evidence of him having done so, and so they never charged him. He was never convicted. He had to spend 20 years of his life basically being exiled by his community because of one test that he failed that said that he lied about killing his wife. And it was later proven through DNA evidence in 2005 that his wife was actually killed by Dennis Rader, known as the BTK killer. And so, can you imagine, you failed one polygraph test, and for the next 20 years of your life, until DNA evidence proves that you're innocent, you're seen as the guy who killed his wife. It's really unfortunate that that would happen to people, but that's what happens when you put too much stock into polygraph tests. There are multiple cases of people having failed polygraph tests, and, you know, you're never able to connect that person to the crime they were being questioned about, or they're later proven innocent. And there are so many people who can pass a polygraph even though they're lying, whether it's about, you know, criminal actions or something that doesn't even matter. But the point is, polygraphs are not reliable. We shouldn't be using them in court. I, for one, am glad that we don't allow them in court. And I know that a lot of people who study cases about, you know, true crime, things that actually happened, murders, disappearances, you study a case and you come across information that, oh, this and this person, they took lie detector tests, and this person failed, but this person passed. So, you know, I think that person who failed might have done it. I think so. They're clearly a bad person. Like, so many people do that, and you shouldn't be doing that because polygraph tests are not reliable. I repeat, not reliable. It just drives me crazy to see people make decisions about who must have done something in a given case just because they failed a polygraph test. They are not reliable. They are not reliable sources of information, and they do not tell you whether a person is lying or not. All it tells you is what physiological responses that person has to being asked a question. And if you really think about it, some questions are gonna make you go, oh my gosh, and like you're gonna freak out, you're gonna start getting nervous, whether you actually committed a crime or not. I know that I have anxiety, and you could ask me a set of questions, and there will be a few questions in there when like I start hearing like certain words or something, or certain phrases, like I'm gonna feel more nervous about answering that question just because of the question. Like, It drives me crazy that people put stock into these tests because they are not reliable. There are studies out there that say that these tests are more reliable than some of the studies that I've looked into. That happens when you're looking at anything. There are going to be studies that basically say one thing, and there are going to be studies that say another thing. If you guys are interested in learning more about polygraph tests and their reliability, I highly suggest that you start with the sources that I have provided for you down below, and then you continue researching. Do more research. Look into studies that give you different results that say that polygraphs are more reliable. Decide for yourself whether or not you think those studies themselves are reliable sources of information, whether they were done properly, whether they had good sample sizes, whether the testing procedures were, on point. Essentially, just make your own decision about this. I highly suggest that you guys continue to look into lie detectors, make your own decisions, but I know that for me, myself, and I do not put any stock whatsoever in a lie detector test. I do not believe that a polygraph machine can detect lies. It just looks at your physiological responses, and you can have those for reasons other than lying. And I feel that it's a very poor practice to use in interrogation. I don't think that we should be using it at all. I'm very glad that we don't use it in court proceedings for criminal trial, and I wish that essentially we could kind of get rid of it in police stations as well. But unfortunately, that's not happening anytime soon. But yeah, that is the lie detector. These are all the reasons why lie detectors tell no truths. You can't trust them. They're not reliable. You shouldn't make decisions about a person's guilt or innocence based on a lie detector test, because there are so many factors that go into whether or not you pass or you fail, that it is not reliable, and the results are examined by human beings. And I'm not saying that anybody is specifically out there to get people taking lie detector tests, but humans make mistakes. We're only human. We make mistakes, whether we mean to or not. It happens. And if you're the one interpreting the results, there's so many things that could sway your opinion, especially because when you're interpreting the results of an actual polygraph test in a real criminal case, you have more information than just the questions that you're asking. You probably know some of the details of the case. Who knows how many details you might actually know. Your opinion might already be swayed. And then that natural bias can, even if it's not on purpose, it can accidentally kind of perverse your view of those results. So I think that I did a lot of research on this. I think that I am still very confident in my opinion that polygraphs are not reliable. And I would like to know what you guys think. Let me know what kind of studies you guys have read, what kind of books you've read on it, articles, anything you guys want to share in the comments down below. I do just ask that you guys remain respectful. I understand that not everybody is going to agree with my opinion that polygraphs are unreliable, but I would hope that we can all have civilized discussion in the comments down below. So feel free to agree or disagree, but try to remain respectful, everybody, and I will see you guys again on Friday for another new video. Bye, everyone.